Okay, so thank you all for joining us on this mini communist school, I suppose we call it. We will be looking over a series of several questions that are important to current events, as well as globally and both locally, so to speak. We'll be going over the Gen Z revolutions. We'll be going over lessons from Communism with a lead-off from the Greek comrades with their experiences with Syriza, and we'll be discussing the communist approach towards the national question. All of these events, the Gen Z revolutions have been rocking well, we've seen like fantastic images coming out of unbelievable images coming out of Southeast Asia, of Nepal, Bangladesh, of palaces burning and ministers being thrown into rivers and whatnot. So it is very important that we understand the nature of these movements, what causes them, and what may be their potential limitations. So I would just like to remind everyone that we have water and coffee available to anyone. If at any moment if you want some water and some coffee, we have them over there. We also have some materials from our section for sale, and of course we have a donation box. If you look over to my comrade over there with a little bust of Marx, with a little big name of Marx. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the lead off to Comrade Emily. She'll be giving an introduction on the Gen Z revolutions. Emily, you have 40 minutes. Yes, we have 40 minutes for lead off and 10 minutes for interventions afterwards. If anyone wants to do an intervention, just come to me and or just raise your hand, actually. Just raise your hand while I write it down.
40 minutes for discussion.
40 minutes for lead off, 40 minutes for intervention, and 10 minutes on.
Alright, thank you. So, for this topic of the Gen Z revolutions, how are we going to approach this question? So, we don't want to take this kind of, it's very tempting to sort of take the point of view of a outside commentator or critic who tend to analyze Gen Z as a matter of sort of a demographic question or a sort of a mood. If you take this approach, you're going to tend to get hung up and fixated on questions like, is a specific movement genuinely Gen Z? Is the movement spontaneous, or is it, manipulated externally? And you're going to get hung up on the question of, well, are these movements matching our programs enough? Are they left enough, or are they just reactionary liberal protests? So all of these questions are relevant to an extent in, the movements we're talking about the Nepal, Indonesia, Bangladesh. We can talk about movements in Bulgaria, Serbia, Madagascar, the protests in Mexico. There's many, many instances we can ask these questions as pertaining to the Gen Z revolutions, but as those building a revolutionary Marxist leadership, I think the more important task is to orient ourselves first inside this revolutionary process that's unfolding around the world. Especially because right now the world is genuinely at a historical turning point. We're entering a new period of instability and mass struggle. And so just to begin with a little bit of a word on the method that we're approaching this with. I'm going to bring up a few times Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which we're reading at the moment in the Bulgarian group, and I think it's quite relevant today, and I think of it especially in connection to this topic of the Gen Z revolutions and the period of history that we're entering into. So basically left-wing communism has a lot of polemics that are useful against ultra-leftism, but more fundamentally it's a text about how revolutionary parties need to think in periods of upheaval, and how they have to avoid basically getting impatient and substituting abstract principles or moralism, for example, in place of a concrete analysis of a living class struggle. So early in the text, Lenin's talking about the significance and specific features of the Russian Revolution, and he writes, I'll quote him, "It would of course be grossly erroneous to exaggerate this truth and to extend it beyond certain fundamental features of our revolution. It would also be erroneous to lose sight of the fact that soon after the victory of the proletarian revolution in at least one of the advanced countries, a sharp change will probably come about. Russia will cease to be the model." So here Lenin is saying that while revolutions have certain fundamental features, vital lessons that are generalizable internationally, of course, no revolution becomes a permanent model. And if we ever try to copy forms like from a template instead of understanding the actual essentials, we're going to stop being Marxists basically, and we're going to become these sort of sectarian sloganeers, imitators. We're going to fall behind and end up tailing the movement. And I think this is very important when we're approaching what are now being called the Gen Z revolutions around the world. These revolutions are a process that the RCI, our organization, is inside of. And to take a proper Marxist approach, what questions do we need to be focusing on and clearly understand? Well, we need to understand what contradictions, first of all, are forcing the masses into action in all these places. Which class layers are moving and how have these changed historically. And then we need to look at where does the movement go beyond its existing leadership and where do we see a lack of organization holding back spontaneity. Most crucial, I think, of all the questions is the question of leadership, which is going to come up, again throughout this lead off and probably throughout this school. And if we keep those things in view, we can basically more adequately compare movements across countries without sort of reducing or collapsing our analysis into a single story and without losing what makes each revolutionary process specific, especially as these movements are erupting in the countries we're working in. So, disclaimer, I'm not going to have time to do justice to all the specific pathways of each of these examples of revolutions, which I hope people can bring up in the interventions in more detail. And I'm also kind of hoping, if you want to think ahead to the discussion, I want to hear some input on how we as an organization can intervene in these kinds of mass protests, given our political goals as the RCI. So, another thing we need to avoid are two common sort of errors in turbulent periods which pertain to these revolutions. The first is falling into kind of a naive liberal romanticism and mistaking the boldness and the scale and the proportion of these movements for strategy. The second error being that of falling into cynicism and dismissing real mass movements as merely politically confused and therefore reactionary or imperialist backed. Because as we'll get to, yes, imperialism can exploit movements and always tries to, but the color revolution theory that's so popular among the Stalinists, who cheerlead the multipolar world, but apparently not any of the mass movements inside it, this does not explain how mass anger, like we're seeing in all of these cases, arises in the first place. And at the same time, we know that spontaneity alone, while it can shake the system, has never been enough to successfully resolve the problem of the question of power. So basically, left-wing communism, Lenin's warning here, is precisely about this kind of trap that a relatively inexperienced socialist movement, which was over in the West at the time he was writing, tends to fall into. And basically, we can take from that without method, we see exactly what Lenin predicts. You sort of have an ultra-left tendency to turn revolutionary enthusiasm into either impatience or paralysis, and fail to correctly assess the movement and our place in it. So, in left-wing communism, Lenin goes on to intervene in a debate about how revolutionary waves develop internationally, and he mentions Karl Kautsky's 1902 text, The Slavs and Revolution, where Kautsky basically says that after 1848, the revolutionary center is shifting from Western Europe towards the East, particularly Russia. And Kautsky had been correct here, because Russia did become the trigger for a world revolutionary wave. But again, if we want to take Lenin's warning against turning such kind of historically specific analysis into a permanent model, we can see today that we don't actually have a single Russia, we don't have a single revolutionary center in the world. Rather, I think what the Gen Z revolutions show is that we're currently living through revolutionary eruptions everywhere across multiple continents, all taking distinctly, national forms. And yet these movements, repeatedly hit limits. Insofar, all of them have been defeated. And we can understand why this is, I think, by looking very carefully at the balance of objective conditions and the subjective factors in the world today. So, one of our comrades, Nicholas Svensson, he formulates this really sharply in his introduction to one of our books, Democracy, Bonapartism, and Fascism. And he says that compared to the earlier decades of the last century, the objective conditions for socialist revolution are far stronger today, but the subjective factor is historically weaker. So just to spell this out a little bit more. So on the objective side, capitalism has massively transformed society since 100 years ago. So especially since the post-war upswing, we see a proletarianization of huge layers of the population. We see the petty bourgeois drastically reduced in size. We see farmers and small shopkeepers, who were historically the base of reaction, Hitler's fascism, for example, playing a far smaller social role. And we also see historically or previously privileged layers of society like teachers, civil servants, technicians, and professionals have been proletarianized as well, meaning they've been pushed into conditions that are increasingly indistinguishable from wage labor. So this means that the working class today is larger, more central, and more socially decisive than ever before. And this is why revolutionary explosions can erupt in countries all around the world. Poor countries, rich countries, the global south, and the imperialist core, they're no longer confined to one region or one type of society. And crucially, as the comrade notes, we are at the early stage of this process, not the end. So this means we can expect repeated explosions, repeated multiple opportunities, and renewed attempts and openings in the class struggle. And so objectively, this is to say that the material conditions for revolution are exceptionally strong. Okay, but then there's a contradiction, which is that on the subjective side, in terms of leadership and organization, we're in a historically weak position compared to 100 years ago. The old mass organizations, the traditional organizations of the working class, have not only degenerated since World War II, but in many cases have completely politically collapsed. So social democracy is now a totally different beast than it was. It's now completely openly pro-capitalist. Communist parties have completely, either dissolved or fused with reformism, and trade union leaderships are basically increasingly functioning just to break strikes instead of lead them. And all of these traditional existing leadership basically fight to defend the status quo, particularly at a time where the status quo around the world has become completely repugnant to a larger and larger majority of workers. And so in mass movements like the Gen Z revolutions, the existing leadership is completely out of touch, it's not revolutionary, and it cannot put forward solutions. In Bulgaria, for example, in the mass protest we had in December, the leading opposition party in the protests, PPDB, they were in favor of replacing the budget that the movement defeated with a budget and policy that were even more aggressive towards workers and more in favor of business. And this isn't really surprising. It doesn't really necessarily mean the protest movement itself was reactionary. What it means is that the leadership, who is in a position to put a brake on the movement, will do so if they can, because they're fully won over to the ruling class. So this isn't some kind of disappointing outcome that disproves Marxism or anything like that. And yeah, we know this is a major issue, the quality of the leadership. In fact, it's basically the biggest obstacle facing the working class today. And basically this contradiction explains the pattern we're seeing around the world in the most recent period, which is of unbearable objective pressure, making these movements erupt suddenly and massively, escalating rapidly since the working class is numerically and socially powerful, but then right away stalling and getting defeated or fragmenting precisely due to the bankruptcy of their leadership. So the current leadership, or that which was developed, improvised on the fly during these movements, cannot pose and cannot answer the question of power. And so they end up going nowhere and quickly liquidating. So yeah, what we're seeing, I think, in the Gen Z revolutions is not a youth movement per se, thank you, but the first political expression of a new generation of proletarianized working class who are entering the struggle without inherited organizations or leadership, and basically without traditions. This movement has the strengths of speed, mass participation, but it's also limited by political confusion, by the fact that they rely on spontaneity, and ultimately this can pretty much guarantee an inability to consolidate any gains. This, of course, then makes the movement vulnerable to exhaustion and to co-option. You know, the movements hit a wall, and it's not due to some moral failing on the part of the masses. It's actually, I think, an expression of this historical contradiction between objectively very ripe conditions combined with a completely bankrupt subjective factor. And Lenin would argue for his time and ours that this contradiction can only be resolved through conscious leadership built before decisive moments, which is precisely what we're trying to do in building the RCI. And so this is why the question of leadership doesn't go away. It's a material necessity imposed by the class struggle itself. Before I talk more about the Gen Z revolutions, I just want to quickly do a sum up. I think it's useful for the whole event of world perspectives. Right now we're living through, as our perspectives explain, an unraveling of the post-World War II world order. The decades after World War II were kind of an anomaly in the history of capitalist decline. There was a sort of pause, or let's say like the inter-imperialist rivalry was muted, class struggle was to some extent contained, and some reforms were possible on the basis of sustained growth and relative stability. And now this period is basically over. And we're back in a world where, for one, inter-imperialist rivalry has openly returned, from the US-China confrontation to proxy war in Ukraine to escalating conflicts in the Middle East. And this is carried out increasingly by military force and sanctions, rather than through institutions like the WTO, UN, World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. And the old framework of multilateral free trade agreements and diplomacy and rules-based order is being torn up. States are now making a turn, you could say, towards prioritizing strategic autonomy, national capital, and are weaponizing tariffs, supply chains, debt, and access to markets to the extent that they can. And then in this context, you basically have this might makes right principle no longer disguised but openly acknowledged. And we see this most clearly in the tactics of Donald Trump, whose aggression and threats in the Americas and Greenland dispense with the language of the pretense of international norms altogether. And this is not a personal Trump thing, but a concentrated expression of the system's decay. And alongside this kind of imperialist breakdown or intensified contradictions, the class struggle is re-emerging in militant forms as the costs of the crisis are pushed more and more downwards onto the working class and youth everywhere. So some highlights that we're seeing around the world. The United States, you're seeing how imperialist breakdown feeds into the class struggle. There were major events, in Minnesota recently that are showing something qualitatively new, not just mass protests, but a de facto political general strike, the first in 80 years in the US, triggered by repression and fueled by accumulated social anger. And here we're seeing political outrage spilling over into strike action and the movement escalating faster than the institutions can control. And it's actually in spite of traditional leadership that these things become political general strikes. It wasn't even the unions who called for this strike. We see the same thing in Italy with the Block Everything movement against the genocide in Palestine a few months ago. Here we saw mass participation in an anti-imperialist political general strike across the country, called for on the basis of international solidarity. And so huge, the willingness of the working class and youth to disrupt business as usual and step up for international solidarity is totally there. And in Italy, for example, the unions were only forced to do anything, they were only forced to say something because of pressure from below, as was the case in the French block everything movement. And so basically in these cases we're seeing this pattern where objective pressure produces explosive struggle. A year ago in Bulgaria, for instance, we were seeing the revolutions, mass movements erupt all around the country. In Serbia, Greece, we had mass protests in Turkey, and we were wondering, why not Bulgaria? And as we said at that point, it was only a question of when. Which, a question which a few months ago, the spontaneous wave of mass protests answered that question. And I think it's the same pretty much anywhere. So now getting to characterizing these Gen Z revolutions, I want to start with the question of the youth and why they're central in these movements. So because the youth have played a prominent role, observers, critics, commentators from the outside have been describing the movements as generational revolts. And the Western media sort of caught on to this. They're leaning into this sort of naive liberal outlook on them, which can also be a little bit condescending or belittling to the protesters, in hopes to perhaps channel their representation of the events along safe lines. But actually this sort of framing with the stereotypical Gen Z protester who's basically just, outraged that they've taken away their social media and they're going to go burn down a building because of that until they get their social media back, that's quite misleading, I think. Youth have been on the forefront, the front line of these movements because they occupy a specific position within the present crisis. They face disproportionately high unemployment in the absence of any stable future under existing conditions. The youth are also unburdened by defeats from the past, and they have the least to lose and the most to gain from a break with the status quo. Therefore, the youth are not likely to sit around and wait for optimal conditions, and they're not going to wait for better leadership to show up before going out to protest. And in many of the countries discussed, young people are entering the political struggle without prior experience in organization, not because they're apolitical, but because the existing political and trade union structures have completely failed to integrate them. And it's been the youth in many cases who have attempted to throw up new leadership, which of course is going to be a learning process. When you have players as young as high schoolers taking part in these movements, they're going to learn a lot, not by Marxist books, but by experience. For example, in the Italy general strike, there were videos of students being beaten by police batons, and obviously that's going to be probably the fastest way to learn about the nature of the state, and from such a young age. These are also experiences which are teaching people the hollowness, the uselessness of bourgeois democracy. And this means that there's going to be a growing layer of youth that are going to draw radical conclusions, which we need to try to connect with. Now, the youth, to their credit, they're quite fast learners. In many cases, they've tried to connect with the workers, and they kind of instinctively know that they need to go beyond just making it a youth-based movement. The students in Serbia, for example, correctly called on the trade unions to organize a general strike against the Vučić regime. And they called for the formation of workplace zborovi, which means mass assemblies as far as I know. But the trade union bureaucrats completely resisted all such calls. And there's many other examples where there's a contrast between the youth taking up the vanguard and the shameful abstention of the existing leadership. And even leaders actively trying to keep the workers away from the movement. The generals in Kenya and Bangladesh, for example, also tried to split the movement. They kept the soldiers, instead of actually trying to send them at the movement to crush it, they had to keep the soldiers confined to the barracks to stop them from joining the revolution, for example. So these factors basically explain the dynamism of the movements and their uneven character, more so, I think, than the average age of the protesters themselves. It's not just young people are high energy. It's not like that, right? It's not about the age. It's about their position, in the current crisis. And I think, nonetheless, the participation of the youth and the molding of a Gen Z movement internationally is a really positive sign of things to come in terms of a newly politicized force entering the global class struggle. And this is a generation who are already learning from both the bitter and the sweet experiences of their struggles, a process which will mature to what Lenin calls a disciplining of the proletariat, not automatically, but if a revolutionary party can intervene to give it orientation. Another striking common feature of these revolutions is the speed which previously stable-seeming regimes fall apart. So a country we've seen can seem calm for a decade, a period of time, where the ruling clique is firmly entrenched, and it may be this way for the entire living memory of some of these youth. Then suddenly the situation transforms and, turns on its head. Parliament buildings are stormed, police are brushed aside, the heads of government flee. We saw this in Sri Lanka in 2022, then in Bangladesh where the police just gave up. They went on strike after 2/3 of their police stations were destroyed, and the hated Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was helicoptered out of the country. We saw the same thing, a quick toppling of the regime in Kenya, Nepal, Indonesia, and similarly with the resignation of the government in Bulgaria, for example, after just a couple of nights of these mass protests. So these movements grew very suddenly and probably surprised the ruling class, who themselves wouldn't have been able to predict the exact timing of such a thing erupting, and they would have basically been afraid of the power of the masses and forced to make concessions or just give up and leave the scene. And on the other hand, in all these examples, we see that bourgeois regimes that appear solid are often extremely weak, and they rest on the inertia and the absence of visible alternatives. So this means they do not, I don't think they have genuine consent of the masses, who in many cases have become alienated from the political system as a whole. When mass pressure is then suddenly released, the system can topple with a remarkable speed, and in this case, the power demonstrated by the masses has been extraordinary. It's been, it's important to remember that no other force in society besides the independent action of the masses could have achieved anything like this. Not, opposition parties, not NGOs, not foreign actors have this kind of power that we've seen topple these regimes. Politically, these movements have expressed themselves most immediately around the question of corruption. So why is that? And what do we do about that? Well, this has led some critics to conclude that the movements lack revolutionary content, since their demands are framed against corruption rather than against capitalism as such. And this conclusion, I think, makes a majorly kind of important to recognize confusion between the form in which social anger initially appears with its underlying cause. So corruption is inseparable from capitalism, and it's basically the most potent and extreme symptom of the rottenness of the capitalist system itself. So Western commentators point to corruption as a feature, an unfortunate feature of the so-called third world, and even as the principal cause of underdevelopment, which I think gets kind of internalized, and you hear things like corruption being, oh, it's a Bulgarian problem, it's a Balkan problem, and that the solution is simply to aggressively reform away the corruption and then get on the normal European path. That's time left, right? Yeah. So of course, this narrative serves to cover up the role of imperialism, which remains the foremost cause of poverty and underdevelopment through debt dependency, unequal exchange, domination by global capital, etc., etc. But similar corruption is rife throughout the world, including in Europe and North America, often in a more institutionalized and legal form. So there's definitely, parallels between the canopy collapse in Novi Sad and the Tempe rail disaster in Greece, or the deadly nightclub fire in Kočani, Macedonia, which brought the masses out to the streets in intense anger. And in these cases, it was corrupt politicians who had cut costs and made shady deals for their own interests, ignoring safety regulation, and they're the ones immediately to blame for the catastrophes, which are forcing working people to count their debt. So in a sense, anti-corruption should be understood as the first political form through which diffuse social pressures crystallize into open opposition. And they're not a mistake, they're not a misdirection or a diversion away from the class struggle, but the point at which the crisis of capitalism becomes politically intelligible for millions of people. And so as communists, we can't dismiss anti-corruption struggles as superficial or moral, no matter if the liberal media tries to do so, no matter if the leadership tries to do so. Rather, our task is to clarify the content of these struggles and to demonstrate how corruption flows from the structure of capitalist society itself. Another recurring feature of the Gen Z revolutions is that of dramatic initial victories followed by rapid political capitulation or consolidation around yet another capitalist government without fundamental change. So in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, you can look for updates to, regime that's there any more than the last or for any period of time, indefinitely. Finally, the last important feature I want to talk about for the Gen Z revolutions is the fact that we have a mass rejection not only of the ruling parties, but of the political system as a whole, often, including the so-called opposition parties. So, slogans such as "Go Home 225" in Sri Lanka, referring to all 225 MPs, or the blanket denunciation of MPs in Kenya as MPigs, and the slogan "Tribalist, Leaderless, Partyless." These all reflect a healthy instinct to reject completely bankrupt parties that exist in these countries. And this generalization is drawn from experience. Opposition parties have proven themselves to be as implicated in the status quo as the ruling parties. In the December protests in Bulgaria, we spoke to people who wanted to keep the movement, quote, away from politics, as if viewing politics as a whole as the root of corruption. However, I don't think this attitude is actually arising from a hostility to politics itself, even though it kind of seems that way. I think it's more of a reflection of the lack of alternative political vehicle that can actually win the trust of the masses and fight for their interests. In Bulgaria, again, like I said, the movement was largely dominated by the right-wing PPDB pseudo-opposition party, whom I would not say has a deep felt support among all but a part of those at the protest, and if so, will not be very long-lived. And basically, this reflects the fact that parliamentary institutions and individual politicians, like those of that party, have been mired in their own scandals time and time again. I teach high school for a job, and for the first time in my 10 or so years of teaching, I'm seeing around half or the majority of my classes going to these protests and putting up, "Don't feed the pig" stickers around the school. And I've talked to them, and most of them have absolutely nothing good to say about the opposition party, depending on who they're talking to. Amongst themselves, they have nothing good to say about the opposition party, who are basically seen as phony tryhards, opportunists who cannot be trusted. And I think young people's instincts are incredibly sharp in this way. And they have a very clear sense that the world has deep problems that the existing authorities are not going to solve, and that we have to solve through an actual mass struggle, through a fight. And yeah, when our group at one point during this protest movement was at an event with some other leftist organizations to discuss the protests, and someone said something along the lines of, quote, "Bulgarians are all secretly anarchists." And I thought this was a bit of wishful thinking, since this person was an anarchist, but it also it contains a grain of truth about how consciousness is developing in today's world. You could almost say there's something of an ultra-left, ultra tendency in terms of the sort of anti-establishment mood we see around the world. At this stage of the process, however, this rejection of the establishment tends to remain negative in character, that is, defined by what it's opposing rather than the emergence of a clearly differentiated political alternative. And just because it happens that the existing parties are tools of this or that faction of the ruling class, this doesn't mean the workers and youth can do without a party. Rather, the situation demands a party and leadership of its own that can represent the masses' interests. And to build out that alternative is our job, basically. Now I've gone over, I think those are what I think are the important common features of these movements, but of course they're all not identical. Each country's movement is shaped by its national history, the structure of the state, the role of debt, imperialism, and so on. These protests emerge for various reasons. It doesn't take much to be enough to trigger these movements. And there's quite a bit of unevenness, forcing us to, reject superficially combining them into some overall Gen Z, phenomenon as if they're all the same. We can't, for example, look at Bulgaria's movement and call it anti-austerity just because we're next to Greece. And we can't also, as Marxists, we do understand that austerity is, inevitable as a result of EU imperialism and the euro crisis, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the form that the protests are taking, as much as they're caused by the same conditions as our neighboring countries. How much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Okay.
Basically.
That's unfortunate. That took way longer than I thought. All right. I wanted to just touch briefly. Well, I wanted to talk less than briefly on the role of imperialism. Basically, because we have a situation, somewhat of a void on the left, a void of leadership, this also creates an opening for right-wing or imperialist intervention, which I think aims to redirect and politically disorient the movement. And the roots of the failure of the left leadership lies in theoretical principles. And I think we can, maybe someone can intervene on Stalinism and the theory of stagism, that basically says that the most pressing tasks in the underdeveloped countries are not socialist tasks, but bourgeois democratic ones, which kind of matches, with the fact that a lot of these protest movements that we're seeing are most immediately about democratic rights. They're calling for an end to arbitrary rule of the oligarchs or elites. They're calling against corruption. They're calling against repression. And capitalism is entrenched in these countries, and yet we have to understand why it consistently fails to deliver on even its supposed democratic promises, which in other countries in the world have been historically achievable through a bourgeois democratic revolution. And here is where, imperialism, we have to understand it properly to understand how imperialism interacts with these protests. So it's imperialism itself that actually prevents the national bourgeoisie from developing and progressing the economy in these countries and from completing these historical tasks. So imperialism subordinates the bourgeoisie of these backwards countries to its own interests against those of the working class. And as a result, the national bourgeoisie is incapable of fighting for the genuine fulfillment of these democratic demands, no matter how progressive its rhetoric may sound. It doesn't matter at all what they're saying. So what we get are these regimes that are deeply enmeshed in imperialism, dependent on the existing bourgeois state apparatus, who are themselves enriched through corruption, which, where is that money coming from? Much of the time it's coming from the imperialist countries. It exploits this whole stagism versus theory of permanent revolution theoretical dispute. The bourgeoisie will cry for an intervention whenever mass protests erupt, like Vučić did in Serbia, for example, and calling on the masses to rally behind him on nationalist lines. Meanwhile, these politicians, their entire record shows that they're in bed with imperialism, and they would not hesitate to use imperialism to smash a genuinely revolutionary movement. And, their fear is obvious from the repressive anti-worker policies that they lean on, which, themselves are part of what's fueling these protests. And so the Stalinists are going to respond to this situation by using fighting imperialism as an excuse to align themselves with the ruling class, often openly right-wing forces who they declared to be the progressive option. And so this is why we see so many leftists making the mistake to stand aside from mass movements altogether or to openly defend the existing regime. So the crucial question is this: what role does imperialism actually play when revolutions erupt, and especially outside of the imperialist core?